Have you ever woken up and realized your body had gone somewhere without you? When I was a kid, there was one place in our house that terrified me more than anything else. It wasn't the basement. It wasn't the woods outside. It was our attic. It wasn't just because it was old. It was because the attic was built like a maze. Strange beams blocked your view. Uneven floorboards waited for one wrong step. No matter where you stood, there was always a dark corner you couldn't see. And every single time I went up there, I had this overwhelming feeling that someone, or something, was hiding just out of sight. Then one morning, I woke up with filthy feet. A few days later, I found an old box of photographs from the attic sitting inside my bedroom. Then an old brass lamp appeared on my desk. I hadn't carried any of those things downstairs, at least. Not while I was awake. That is when I realized I wasn't just sleepwalking. Night after night, I was somehow climbing into that attic while I was completely unconscious. And one night, I woke up. Not in my bed, not even in my bedroom. I woke up standing in the middle of that attic, surrounded by total darkness. I couldn't see the ladder, I couldn't see the walls, and then I heard footsteps. To this day, everyone tells me it was just sleepwalking. But I know what I heard, and I still believe I wasn't alone up there. Growing up, I was never afraid of the basement the way most kids were. Everyone talks about basements like they're the creepiest place in a house, but for me, it was always the attic. Even now, years later, I still can't explain why. There was just something about that place that made every instinct in my body tell me not to stay there any longer than I absolutely had to. Our attic wasn't the kind you usually see in movies. It wasn't a tiny crawl space where you had to bend over every few feet. It was surprisingly spacious, almost like an unfinished room stretching across the entire house. You could stand up comfortably almost anywhere. Most people would probably think that made it less intimidating, but somehow it had the exact opposite effect. My parents treated it like nothing more than a storage room. Every Christmas decoration, every old family photo album, broken lamp, forgotten toy, and dusty cardboard box eventually found its way up there. Looking back now, something else stands out to me. Neither of my parents ever spent more time in the attic than they absolutely had to. They'd go up, grab what they needed, and come right back down. At the time, I never questioned it. As a kid, you don't notice little things like that. As an adult, they seem a lot stranger. The attic itself felt like a maze. Thick wooden support beams stood at random angles with no pattern whatsoever. Some sections of the floor were higher than others, forcing you to constantly watch where you step. From any single spot, you could never see the entire attic. Every few feet, another beam blocked your view, creating dark blind spots where anything or anyone could have been standing without you ever knowing. That was what terrified me the most. Every time I climbed that pull-down ladder, I felt like someone was silently watching me from behind one of those beams. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced I'd see a face staring back at me. Of course, there never was, at least. That is what I believed. This all happened when I was in middle school. I don't remember much else from that time in my life, but this memory has stayed with me in crystal clear detail. It is burned into my mind in a way that no happy childhood memory ever could. One ordinary school morning, I woke up, sat on the edge of my bed, and noticed something that instantly made me stop. The bottoms of both my feet were covered in gray dust and dirt. There was grime packed between my toes like I'd been walking barefoot somewhere filthy all night. The problem was, I had gone straight to bed the night before. At first, I figured I'd somehow walked outside barefoot without remembering. It didn't make much sense, but I was still a kid, and kids don't usually jump to terrifying conclusions over dirty feet. I simply rinsed them off in the bathtub, got dressed for school, and forgot about it. Or at least I tried to. A few days later, something happened that made it impossible to ignore. When I walked into my bedroom after school, there was a small cardboard box sitting on the floor beside my desk. I knew immediately it didn't belong there. Curious, I opened it and found dozens of old family photographs inside. They were faded, dusty, and instantly familiar because I'd seen my parents storing boxes just like that in the attic for years. I couldn't remember bringing it downstairs. Not even a little. When my mom saw it later that evening, she barely reacted. She just assumed I'd gone digging through the attic while she wasn't paying attention. "Why were you messing around up there?" she asked. I stared at her, completely confused. I wasn't. She gave me one of those looks parents give when they think you are obviously lying. "You must have been. Those pictures have been stored upstairs for years." I kept insisting I had never touched them, but eventually she shrugged, carried the box back to the attic, and acted like it wasn't worth talking about anymore. I wish that had been the end of it. A few mornings later, I woke up and found something even stranger waiting for me. Sitting perfectly in the middle of my desk was an old brass lamp. It was ugly, dusty, and unmistakably from the attic. I recognized it immediately because I'd seen it sitting in the same corner upstairs for as long as I could remember. I just stood there staring at it. There was no possible explanation. Moving a heavy lamp downstairs wasn't something I could have done without remembering it. Someone would have seen me. Someone would have heard me, unless I hadn't been awake. Suddenly everything started connecting: the dirty feet, the photographs, the lamp. The answer hit me so hard it actually made my stomach drop. I wasn't wandering around the house in my sleep every single time. I was somehow climbing into that attic while I was completely unconscious. For some reason, the realization didn't terrify me right away. It mostly confused me. The idea that I could climb into the most frightening place in our house without waking up seemed impossible. Our attic wasn't safe even in broad daylight. The uneven floorboards, exposed beams, and narrow walkways made it easy to trip if you weren't paying attention. Yet somehow, while I was asleep, I managed to navigate the entire thing without falling, without getting hurt, and without remembering a single second of it. I told my parents everything. I explained the dirty feet, the photographs, the lamp. I even admitted that I thought I had been sleepwalking into the attic. They weren't alarmed. My mom smiled sympathetically and said plenty of kids sleepwalk. My dad agreed, saying I'd probably outgrow it just like a lot of children do. They weren't dismissing me exactly, but they certainly weren't treating it like the nightmare it had become in my mind. To them, it was just another childhood phase. To me, it was the beginning of something I couldn't control. After that conversation, bedtime became the worst part of every day. Instead of falling asleep, I'd lie awake for hours, forcing my eyes to stay open. Every time I felt myself getting tired, I'd sit up, turn on my bedside lamp, or walk around my room just to keep myself awake a little longer. I wasn't afraid of having a nightmare. I was afraid of what I might do after I closed my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion always won. Every single morning became a routine. Before I even got out of bed, I'd pull my knees toward my chest and check the bottoms of my feet. If they were clean, I could finally breathe. If they were dirty, I knew I'd gone back. Most mornings they were perfectly clean, but every now and then, that thin layer of gray attic dust would be there again, packed between my toes exactly like before. Those were the mornings that ruined the rest of my day, because every dirty footprint proved one horrifying fact. While I was asleep, I kept returning to the attic. And the most terrifying part wasn't that I was going there. It was realizing I had absolutely no idea how long I stayed there before finding my way back to bed. The fear slowly took over my life. It wasn't the kind of fear that hit you all at once. It was quieter than that. It followed me everywhere. I'd be sitting in class trying to pay attention, and suddenly I'd wonder if I'd been in the attic the night before. I'd catch myself staring at the clock all day, dreading the moment I'd have to go back to bed. It felt like every night had become a gamble. Then came the night I'll never forget. I opened my eyes expecting to see my bedroom ceiling. Instead, everything around me was completely black. For several long seconds, I couldn't even understand what was happening. I wasn't lying down. I was standing perfectly still. My heart immediately started racing. I slowly reached my hands out in front of me, but they disappeared into darkness. I couldn't see my own fingers. Then reality finally hit me. I wasn't in my bedroom. I was standing inside the attic. I was fully awake, in complete darkness. The fear that crashed over me was impossible to describe. Every breath became shallow. My chest felt so tight I thought I might pass out. I knew how dangerous that attic was during the daytime. At night, without a single source of light, it was practically a death trap. I had no idea where I was standing. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there, and I had absolutely no clue where the attic hatch was. I stood frozen, terrified that even one step in the wrong direction could send me crashing through the ceiling or straight into one of the heavy support beams. Finally, I forced myself to move. One tiny step, then another. I shuffled my feet across the floor as carefully as I could, reaching into the darkness with trembling hands, hoping to touch a wall, a beam, anything that could help me figure out where I was. By then, tears were already running down my face. I wasn't sobbing. I wasn't screaming. I was crying silently because something deep inside me kept whispering one horrifying thought: you are not alone. I couldn't explain why I felt it. There was no evidence, no voices, no movement, just a crushing certainty that something else was somewhere inside that attic, standing perfectly still, watching me struggle through the darkness. Then I heard it. Asterisk, asterisk, a soft sound somewhere behind me. I froze. Every muscle in my body locked up. A few seconds passed. Then another sound. This time it came from a different direction, like someone had quietly shifted their weight across the wooden floorboards. My breathing became so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I kept moving, terrified to stop. Then, a third footstep echoed through the darkness, and in that moment, I stopped believing I was the only one in that attic. I have no idea how long I spent stumbling through that darkness. It felt like forever. Every step was painfully slow. I kept one hand stretched out in front of me while the other searched for anything solid to hold on to. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely keep my balance, and every few seconds I'd stop just to listen. Nothing. Then another thud. Asterisk asterisk, this one sounded closer. Not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. Like someone had taken a single careful step after realizing I was trying to escape. At that point, I was completely convinced there was someone else in the attic with me. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to know what might be standing behind me. I just kept moving, praying my next step would somehow lead me back to the attic hatch. Eventually, my hand brushed against a wooden frame. I nearly collapsed with relief. I felt around until my fingers found the edge of the opening and the pull-down ladder. Without thinking, I practically threw myself down the ladder and sprinted through the hallway as fast as I could. I burst into my parents' bedroom sobbing uncontrollably. By then, I couldn't hold it together anymore. I told them everything. I told them I'd woken up in the attic. I told them I'd had to find my way through complete darkness. And I told them I had heard footsteps following me. I expected my dad to jump out of bed, grab a baseball bat, and storm upstairs. Instead, my mom wrapped me in a hug and tried to calm me down. She told me sleepwalking could be frightening but wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch if it would help me feel safer. I immediately said yes. But I begged them to check the attic first. I needed someone else to see what I had experienced. After a long pause, my dad finally agreed. I stood in the hallway watching him climb the ladder, and I honestly believed there was a chance he wasn't coming back down. Every second felt like an hour. Then, less than 2 minutes later, he climbed back down as casually as if he'd gone to grab a toolbox. "There isn't anyone up there," he said. "Go back to bed." That should have comforted me. It didn't. If anything, it made everything even worse, because I knew what I had heard. After that night, something changed. The sleepwalking stopped completely. I never woke up with dirty feet again. Nothing from the attic ever appeared in my bedroom, and I never found myself standing in that darkness again. Most people would call that a happy ending. I can't. Even now, after all these years, I still can't fully accept the explanation that it was only sleepwalking. How did I always end up in the attic? Never the kitchen, never the living room, never anywhere else in the house. How did I navigate that maze of beams and uneven floorboards in complete darkness without ever falling? And most importantly, if those sounds were only part of my imagination, why do they still sound so real every time I think about that night? I've asked my parents about it countless times over the years. Their answer has never changed. They insist it was nothing more than sleepwalking. Sometimes, though, the way they avoid talking about it makes me wonder if they know something they're choosing not to tell me. Maybe they really don't. Or maybe there was something in that attic after all. And whatever it was never interested in my parents. It was waiting for me. This happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old, back when my family still lived in an old house that had been passed down through generations. My dad had grown up there. Before him, my grandparents had lived there. As far as anyone in my family knew, the house had always belonged to us. It was one of those old homes that seemed to carry decades of memories inside its walls. Every room had furniture older than I was, every floorboard creaked under your weight, and every closet was packed with things nobody had touched in years. Like most old houses, it had an attic. Nobody really cared about it except around Christmas. The attic was basically a dumping ground for everything no one wanted to throw away: old furniture, dusty boxes, forgotten keepsakes, broken lamps, family junk. And, of course, the Christmas decorations. Every December, someone had to climb up there to drag everything back down. That year, my dad decided I was finally old enough to do it myself. Before I climbed the ladder, he spent several minutes explaining exactly which boxes I needed to grab. The lights are toward the back. The ornaments are stacked on the left. Don't bring down the old decorations. He kept talking, and I kept pretending to listen. Truthfully, I wasn't paying attention to a single word. By the time I reached the attic, I realized I couldn't remember any of his instructions. Normally, I would have gone back downstairs and asked again. Except, my dad absolutely hated repeating himself. If I came back asking the same questions he'd just answered, he'd be irritated for the rest of the afternoon. So I decided to figure it out myself. I started opening random boxes, hoping I'd eventually stumble across the Christmas decorations. 20 minutes later, the attic looked like a tornado had ripped through it. Boxes were everywhere. Furniture had been shoved aside. Dust floated through the air every time I moved another container. Eventually, I did find everything I needed. I carried the decorations downstairs one load at a time until the living room was full of Christmas boxes. Then I climbed back into the attic one last time. I wanted to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. Standing there looking at the mess I'd created, something caught my eye. Hidden behind a pile of boxes I'd moved earlier was a black storage case I'd never seen before. It looked older than everything else in the attic, and somehow, it felt like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked over, brushed a thick layer of dust off the lid, and pulled the box into the middle of the attic. It wasn't made of cheap cardboard like everything else up there. It was solid, almost like an old document case or a fireproof storage box. Even though it looked sturdy, it somehow felt older than every other object surrounding it. I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't old family photographs. The box was completely packed with papers. There were notebooks with worn-out covers, loose handwritten pages, folded maps, and even sheets of old music. Every single piece of paper was covered in handwriting from top to bottom. Some pages were written so heavily that there wasn't a single blank space left. I sat down right there on the attic floor. At first, I figured they were just old family records, but the more pages I flipped through, the stranger everything became. The earliest entries were completely ordinary: weather observations, shopping lists, small notes about chores around the house, random thoughts written before bed. It felt like I was reading someone's personal journal from decades earlier. None of the pages had dates, but whoever had organized them had placed everything in what seemed to be chronological order. The oldest writings were on top, while the more recent entries were buried deeper inside the box. As I kept reading, I noticed something disturbing. The handwriting slowly began to change. The neat, careful writing gradually became rushed. Letters overlapped each other. Words became harder to read. Entire sentences looked as though they'd been scribbled in a panic. Then I reached the pages where everything took a dark turn. The writer had become completely obsessed with one thing. The attic, page after page, described nothing except the attic. Measurements, sketches, rough diagrams, calculations. The writer kept measuring the attic over and over again, comparing its dimensions to the size of the house below. According to those calculations, something didn't add up. There was supposed to be several feet of missing space running along one side of the attic. Space that shouldn't have existed. The writer became convinced there was a hidden area sealed behind one particular wall. Every crack, every dent, every scratch, every tiny imperfection on that wall had been carefully documented. Some pages contained nothing except incredibly detailed drawings of that single wall from different angles. By now, I had completely forgotten about Christmas decorations. I couldn't stop reading. With every page, the entries became more frantic. The writer claimed to be spending entire nights in the attic. Sometimes they even slept up there. Then came the part that made my stomach tighten. The journal stopped talking about measurements. Instead, it started talking about sounds. Scratching, slow breathing, soft noises coming from behind the hidden wall. One page simply read, "Fine 2:14 a.m. Scratching continued for approximately 3 minutes. Another described hearing something moving inside the missing space. Another insisted the sounds were getting closer every night. I didn't believe any of it. I told myself whoever wrote these pages had slowly lost their mind. But as I turned the next few pages, I wasn't nearly as confident anymore. The farther I read, the more unsettling the journal became. The writer was no longer documenting observations. They were documenting an obsession. Entire pages were filled with measurements of the same wall, written over and over again, as if they were trying to prove something to themselves. The missing space was real. They were convinced of it. According to their calculations, the attic was several feet shorter than it should have been. The house below was wider than the attic above it, leaving a section of space that simply couldn't be explained. That impossible gap became all they could think about. The journal described spending hours sitting in front of the wall, sometimes all night, sometimes until sunrise, waiting, listening. The entries became increasingly paranoid. One claimed they could hear slow scratching behind the boards. Another described what sounded like someone breathing on the other side. One page contained nothing except a single sentence written over and over again. "It is getting closer. ***. By now, I was reading as fast as I could. I wanted to reach the end. I wanted some kind of explanation. Instead, the writing became almost impossible to read. The neat handwriting from the beginning had completely disappeared. Words were scribbled over each other. Entire paragraphs were crossed out. Then I reached the final pages. There were no sentences anymore. No diary entries. No explanations. Just hundreds, maybe thousands of tally marks, row after row, column after column. Each one perfectly counted, but counted for what? Days, noises? Footsteps? I had no idea. Then the journal simply ended, no final entry, no goodbye, nothing. It was as if the writer had vanished in the middle of whatever they had been documenting. For several minutes, I just sat there staring at the papers. Every rational part of my brain kept telling me the writer had probably suffered from some kind of mental illness. That explanation made the most sense. It had to. But before putting everything back, I found myself looking toward the wall the journal had described dozens of times. I told myself I was only going to take one quick look, nothing more. I walked across the attic. The closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. Then I noticed something that made my entire body go cold. The wall actually had the same cracks, the same dents, the same tiny imperfections. Exactly where the journal said they would be. I froze. For the first time since opening that black box, I wasn't just reading someone else's fear anymore. I was standing exactly where they had stood. And suddenly, the attic no longer felt empty. It felt like someone else was in there with me, watching, waiting. Without wasting another second, I slammed the lid shut on the box, grabbed it with both hands, and hurried toward the attic ladder. I didn't care how heavy it was. I just wanted to get downstairs. I needed my dad to see what I had found. My dad could tell something was wrong the second I walked into the living room. I was pale, out of breath, still clutching the black box against my chest. Without saying much, I handed it to him and told him he needed to read it. He looked confused at first, but after flipping through a few pages, the expression on his face slowly changed. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't smiling either. He quietly closed the box and asked me to show him exactly where I'd found it. A few minutes later, we were both standing back in the attic. For the first time since discovering those journals, I didn't feel completely alone. My dad studied the wall much more carefully than I had. Every few moments he'd glance down at one of the sketches, compare it to the wood in front of him, then move a few inches and check again. Neither of us spoke. The attic was completely silent. Finally, he stopped moving. He just stood there staring at the wall. "I think they're right," he said quietly. Before I could even ask what he meant, he turned around and climbed back downstairs. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a pry bar, a hammer, and a few other tools from the garage. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I am opening it." Those words sent a chill straight through me. Part of me wanted him to stop. Another part desperately needed to know what was behind that wall. The first swing of the hammer echoed through the entire attic. Dust exploded into the air. The second strike cracked one of the old boards, then another. And another. Within minutes, pieces of the wall began falling away. Finally, there was a hole large enough to see inside. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared. The journal had been right. There really was a hidden space behind the wall, not just a narrow gap. An entire room-sized cavity stretched the full length of the attic. It shouldn't have existed, but it did. Slowly, my dad pulled away more of the boards until the entire opening was exposed. The space was completely empty, at least. Almost empty. Every wall inside was covered with black markings. Thousands of them, long lines. Strange symbols, shapes that didn't resemble letters, numbers, or anything either of us recognized. They weren't random, but they weren't any language we'd ever seen. It looked as though someone had spent months, maybe years, covering every inch of those walls. Then my dad noticed something that made the situation even worse. There isn't another entrance. He was right. We searched every corner, the floor, the ceiling. Both side walls, there wasn't a single doorway, hatch, tunnel, or crawl space leading into that hidden room. The only opening now was the hole my dad had just created, which meant one terrifying thing. If someone had covered those walls with all those markings, they would have had to do it before the wall was sealed. But according to the journals, the writer had been describing those markings while the wall was already standing. That wasn't possible. Nothing about it made sense. After making sure the hidden space was truly empty, we climbed back downstairs carrying the black box with us. For the rest of the evening, neither of us talked very much. Eventually, my dad admitted something that hadn't occurred to me. The person who wrote these journals probably isn't the one who organized them. He pointed toward the perfectly stacked notebooks. They were carefully sorted, preserved, almost like someone wanted them to be found. He was right. Someone consumed by obsession probably wouldn't neatly archive years of journals inside a sturdy storage box. Someone else had done that. Then my dad became unusually quiet. After several minutes, he finally spoke. "I think my father found these." My grandfather. According to my dad, he'd probably discovered the journals years earlier, gathered every page together, placed them inside that black box, and quietly hid them in the attic. He never mentioned them, not once. And because both of my grandparents had already passed away, there was no one left to ask. Years later, after we'd moved out of that house, I asked my dad what happened to the box. He told me he left it behind. He didn't want it. He didn't even want to look at it anymore. To this day, I still don't know what to believe. Maybe the journals belonged to someone who slowly lost their mind. Maybe the hidden room had a perfectly logical explanation. But one question has never left me. If there was absolutely no way into that hidden space, how did the writer know exactly what was inside it before anyone ever opened the wall? I've been smoking for over 20 years. At this point, it isn't even a habit anymore. It is a ritual, a way to clear my head after a long day. One rule I've never broken, though, is that I refuse to smoke inside my house. My parents had the exact same rule when they lived there, even though my dad enjoyed the occasional cigar. The smell never belonged indoors. About 4 years ago, my parents retired and moved to Florida. They talked about leaving for years, but they didn't want to sell the family home. Instead, they handed it down to me. The timing couldn't have been better. I'd recently gone through a divorce and was living alone in a tiny apartment that felt more depressing every day. Moving into the old family house felt like a fresh start, at least. That is what I thought. The only downside was how enormous the place felt with just one person living there. It was a 3-story colonial that had been standing for generations. Every floor creaked. Every staircase groaned. Every door seemed to complain whenever it opened. Living alone in a house that old teaches you to ignore strange noises. Otherwise, you'd never sleep. Behind the house was a huge backyard that stretched almost an acre before disappearing into a line of trees. Every night before bed, I'd grab a cigarette and walk the property. No phone. No music. Just me, the crickets, the wind, and the glowing ember at the end of my cigarette. The walk usually took about 10 minutes. It became my way of shutting my brain off after work. There was one detail about the house that always caught my eye during those walks. The attic. Like most old homes, mine had one accessible through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It was nothing more than a storage space filled with my parents' old belongings, forgotten holiday decorations, and boxes I hadn't opened since moving in. There was also a tiny attic window overlooking the backyard. It couldn't have been more than a foot wide. I'd looked at that window hundreds of times during my nightly walks. Nothing had ever seemed unusual about it, until one night. About 3 weeks ago, I was halfway through my usual lap around the yard when, for no particular reason, I glanced up at the house. Something moved behind the attic window. It was only for a split second. A dark shape, almost like someone had quietly walked past the glass. I stopped dead in my tracks. I stared at the window for nearly a minute. Nothing. The attic was dark, completely still. Eventually, I laughed at myself. It was probably a reflection, maybe a bird, maybe a bat flying past the window. Old houses make you imagine things. That is what I told myself. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I wish it had only happened once. The following night, I found myself watching that little attic window long before I reached it. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous. If something had really been up there the night before, I'd have heard it. Old houses don't exactly keep secrets. Every loose floorboard, every settling beam, every opening door announces itself. Still, as I rounded the corner of the backyard, my eyes drifted upward. There it was again, movement. Not outside the window, behind it. A dark silhouette slowly passed across the glass before disappearing back into the shadows. This time I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was inside my attic. My first thought was that an animal had gotten in. Squirrels, raccoons, even possums find their way into old houses all the time. That explanation made the most sense, until I thought about the size of what I'd just seen. Whatever moved behind that window looked much too large to be a squirrel. I stood in the yard for another minute hoping I'd see it again. Nothing. Finally, I crushed my cigarette under my shoe and walked back toward the house. The moment I stepped inside, the silence felt different. Normally, the place creaked constantly. That night, it was completely still. I stood at the bottom of the staircase staring toward the upstairs hallway where the attic ladder was hidden in the ceiling. No scratching, no footsteps, no movement. Just silence. Part of me wanted to lock the doors, ignore everything I'd seen, and go straight to bed. The other part knew I wouldn't sleep until I checked, so I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and slowly pulled the attic ladder down. Even that simple sound made me jump. The wooden ladder unfolded with a loud crack, echoing through the empty house. I swallowed hard and started climbing. The design of the attic made everything worse. Until your head clears the opening, you can't actually see inside if someone or something was standing only a few feet away. You wouldn't know until it was too late. Every rung felt heavier than the last. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it inside my ears. Finally, I lifted my head above the opening and immediately wished I hadn't. The attic looked like a disaster zone. Boxes were overturned everywhere. Plastic storage bins had been ripped open. Old furniture was flipped onto its side. It looked as though someone had torn through every single thing stored up there, but that wasn't what froze me in place. Every wall, every wooden beam, even sections of the ceiling were covered in a thick black substance. At first, I thought it was paint, but it didn't look like ordinary paint. It was smeared on in uneven streaks, almost as if someone had spread it with their bare hands. Even worse, it looked wet. Fresh in several places, it was still slowly dripping down the walls. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. For one horrifying second, my mind convinced itself that whoever had done this was still standing somewhere in that attic, watching me for a few terrifying seconds. I couldn't make myself move. I just stood there at the top of the ladder, staring at those walls. The black substance looked far too fresh to have been there for long. Thick streaks slowly crept down the wooden beams, gathering into heavy drops before falling onto the floor below. Whatever had happened, it hadn't happened days ago. It looked like it had happened minutes earlier. My first thought wasn't supernatural. It was much worse. Someone had broken into my house. Someone had been inside while I was outside smoking. Trying to keep my breathing under control, I slowly swept my phone's flashlight across the attic. Left, right. Behind the old furniture, between the stacks of boxes, every corner. I didn't see anyone. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made everything more confusing. The attic wasn't very large. If another person had been hiding up there, I should have found them immediately. I backed down the ladder as fast as I could without falling. The second my feet hit the hallway floor, fear gave way to adrenaline. If someone had vandalized my attic, they could still be somewhere inside the house. I wasn't about to wait around and find out. I searched every room. The bedrooms, the bathrooms, the closets, the basement. I even checked behind shower curtains and inside every room with the lights off. By the time I finished searching, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I returned to my bedroom upstairs, trying to convince myself the intruder had already escaped. Maybe they'd slipped out the back door while I was checking another room. Maybe I really had missed them. I leaned against the bedroom wall and took a slow breath. Then, thump. Asterisk, asterisk, a heavy sound echoed through the ceiling. I froze. A second later, another thump. This time it was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. The noise came directly from above me. The attic. Every hair on my arm stood up. I realized exactly what had happened. Whoever was up there had never left. They'd been hiding the entire time, probably behind one of the overturned storage bins while I made that quick sweep with my flashlight. The thought made my stomach twist. I couldn't call the police yet. Not while someone was still inside my house. Something inside me snapped. That house had belonged to my parents. It was the home I grew up in. Whoever was hiding upstairs had violated it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs into the kitchen. I yanked open the knife drawer and grabbed the largest kitchen knife I owned. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I wasn't trying to be brave. I was terrified. But fear has a strange way of turning into anger. Clutching the knife, I climbed the stairs one final time. Every step toward the attic felt heavier than the last. Whatever was waiting above me, I was finally going to face it. Before I could lose my nerve, I shoved the attic ladder open and climbed as fast as I could. The knife was clenched so tightly in my hand that my fingers were starting to go numb. The moment my head cleared the opening, I snapped. I started screaming. Not just yelling, full-on screaming at the top of my lungs. Get out of my house. I charged into the attic, waving the knife wildly in front of me. Part of me wanted to scare whoever was hiding up there. The other part was desperately trying to convince myself I wasn't completely terrified. I kicked over storage bins, shoved old furniture aside, pulled open every box that was big enough to hide someone. I searched every single corner. Nothing. No person. No animal. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The attic was completely empty. Then my flashlight caught something I hadn't noticed before. I slowly lowered the beam toward one of the support beams. My stomach dropped. Deep scratch marks covered the wood. Not tiny scratches, massive gouges. Some were several feet long, carved so deeply into the beams that fresh wood was visible beneath them. I turned toward another wall, more scratches. The floorboards, the ceiling joists, even some of the old storage trunks had been ripped apart by whatever made them. The thick black substance was still smeared everywhere. But now, the scratches cut straight through it, as though they had been made after the black material had already been spread across the attic. I couldn't explain any of it, and I wasn't about to stay there long enough to try. Every ounce of courage I'd forced myself to find disappeared in an instant. I backed toward the attic opening without taking my eyes off the darkness around me. Then I practically threw myself down the ladder. I ran all the way to the downstairs bathroom, locked the door behind me, and finally called 911. The operator kept asking if I was safe. I wasn't sure how to answer. The police arrived roughly 15 minutes later. 3 officers entered the house. 2 of them immediately went upstairs to search the attic while the third stayed downstairs with me, asking questions about everything I'd seen. Those 15 minutes waiting for the officers to come back down felt longer than the entire night. Finally, they returned. The attic's empty. That was the first thing one of them said. No one was inside. No animal, no evidence that anyone was hiding anywhere in the house. I immediately asked about the black substance covering the walls. They confirmed it was there. They saw the overturned boxes. They saw the damage. They even photographed the deep scratches carved into the beams. Then they told me something that made even less sense. There were no openings anywhere. No broken windows. No damaged roof. No holes large enough for an animal or a person to enter through. According to them, whoever had done all that must have entered and left through the house itself. I argued with them. That was impossible. This house was ancient. Every single step echoed through the floors. If someone had walked downstairs, opened a door, or even crossed the hallway, I would have heard it. But the officers had no better explanation. After taking my statement, they eventually left. That was 3 weeks ago. Nothing else has happened since. Every night, I still catch myself looking toward that tiny attic window before I go back inside. Sometimes I think I see movement. Sometimes I tell myself it is only my imagination. Friends have suggested that maybe a homeless person somehow got inside, vandalized the attic, and slipped away before I noticed. That is the explanation everyone seems happiest accepting. I wish I could believe it, but I can't. Because no homeless person could have vanished from that house without making a sound. No homeless person could have left behind those impossible scratches. And no homeless person could explain why something was moving behind that attic window. Before I ever climbed up there, I still haven't cleaned the attic. I haven't even gone back inside it. Every box, every scratch, every streak of that black substance is still exactly where I found it that night. Maybe one day I'll finally work up the courage to clear everything out. Or maybe some things are better left undisturbed. Because if there is one thing that night taught me, it is that sometimes the scariest part isn't finding out what was in your attic. It is realizing whatever was there may never have actually left. 3 different attics, 3 different people, 3 experiences that should have had simple explanations: sleepwalking, old journals, an intruder. But none of those explanations ever answered the questions that mattered most. How do you wake up in the same attic over and over without remembering how you got there? How can someone describe a hidden room that shouldn't have been accessible in the first place? And how does an entire attic get torn apart while the person living beneath it never hears anyone come or go? Maybe every one of these stories has a perfectly logical explanation. Or maybe some places hold on to things we were never meant to understand. Old attics have a strange reputation for collecting forgotten memories, abandoned possessions, and family secrets. But every once in a while, they seem to collect something else entirely. Something that doesn't want to be found. And once it notices you found it, you never really stop wondering if it followed you back downstairs. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 3 attic horror stories disturbed you the most? The Moldy Theory number 1, the sleepwalker who kept waking up in the attic. Story number 2, the impossible hidden room behind the wall. Or story number 3, the attic that looked like something had been living inside it. Let me know your answer down in the comments. And if you've ever experienced something strange in an attic, basement, or anywhere inside your home, tell us your story. Who knows, it might appear in a future video. If you've experienced a true scary story that still keeps you awake at night, I'd love to read it. Whether it happened in your home, while camping, at work, on the road, or anywhere else. Send your true story using the email in the description below. Your story could be featured in an upcoming video, and if you prefer to stay anonymous, just let me know when you submit it. If you enjoy true horror stories like these, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next upload. New terrifying stories are posted regularly, and trust me, the next one might be even harder to explain. Tonight, before you go to sleep, take one last look at your attic. Just make sure nothing is looking back.